and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. In terms of apologies, we have received an apology from Councillor Harley this evening, and we will now turn to public question time. So I'd like to welcome a very full public gallery this evening. Welcome everyone to the meeting. Just to explain for those who haven't been to a council meeting before, this is actually the council briefing. So we have a two-stage process where on the Tuesday before the council meeting where we make the decisions, we have this briefing with the primary purpose for council members to ask questions of administration in relation to the recommendations and reports made to council. It's also an opportunity for you to come forward to the microphone during public question time and to make a statement relevant to an item that's on the agenda this evening, and to ask any questions as well, which we will then ask on your behalf when we get to the item. Because we do have such a large turnout this evening, I'd just like to stress to you that to keep the meeting running smoothly, we do request that you speak for 3 minutes at a maximum, and the CEO David does time that, so we do keep to time. It's not to be rude, it's just to try to be efficient. And we do ask that when you come up to the microphone you state your name and the suburb in which you live and the item that you're speaking to. And also, because items can lead to lots of passion, you know, everybody has a really strong point of view on occasion, we do ask that your comments are respectful. So there's no set order, it's just whoever wishes to come up to the microphone first. So I'll call the first speaker forward. Start asking questions on the items. I will just go to the CEO for declarations of interest.
Thank you, Mayor Cole. I've received 3 declarations of interest. The first is from Councillor Murphy in relation to item 5.10 regarding parklets. It's a declaration affecting impartiality. Councillor Murphy knows the owners of both Just Burgers and Pinchos who support Leaderville Connect in the events in which Councillor Murphy's company, Upbeat Events, is a contractor to deliver. The second relates to declaration of financial interest from Councillor Toppelberg in relation to item 5.7. Councillor Toppelberg declares that his interest is the applicant is a current client of his business. As a consequence, there may be a perception that his interest on the matter may be affected. Councillor Toppelberg is not seeking approval to participate in the debate or to remain in the chambers or vote on the matter. The third declaration is from Councillor Rodan in relation to item 8.1, a disclosure of interest affecting impartiality. Councillor Rodan declares that his interest in this matter is that he plays indoor soccer with people who are members of the club and executive. As a consequence, there may be a perception that his impartiality on the matter may be affected. He declares that he will consider this matter on its merits and vote accordingly. Thank you, Mayor Cole.
Thank you, CEO. There are 2 planning items on this evening's agenda that have garnered quite a lot of interest, so what we'll do is go to those items first, given that there are members of the public gallery here waiting to hear the questions that council members ask. So I did a quick count and it looked like 5.2 just had slightly more speakers, so we'll go to item 5.2 first, and that is number 377 Wolcott Street, Corbin, for multiple dwellings. Councillors, questions on this item? Councillor Rodan.
Few questions. The first one is just around building height. There was a couple of questions from the gallery around clarifying if this height is correct and where it is measured from the natural ground level because of the slope of the block. I think there's about a 1 to 2 metre fall from the front to the back, and so where do we measure the natural ground level from, and is that actually compliant?
Yesiree, Mayor Cole, the height is measured from the natural ground level at the point of the wall height, so it's not an average or taken from the street or anything like that. It's measured at the point that the wall is proposed, and the heights comply with the deemed to comply standards, and the heights vary across the site because the natural ground level changes. But in essence, the maximum height's around 10 metres and the deemed to comply maximum height is 11.2 for a building with the roof form that this building proposes.
Second one is around overshadowing, and I believe it's a 32% overshadowing to the property to the south-east direction. Deemed to comply as less than 50%. When and how is that measured?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole. The city has software that the plans are put into, and we measure the overshadowing using that software. It's detailed software that takes the actual building design, the exact detail of the height, setbacks, etc., and takes the natural ground level of the adjoining property at the boundary and determines the overshadowing through that process. So it's an exact process. It's been tested through SAT previously. The majority of local governments use the same software to do that assessment.
The visitor parking bays appear to be right behind the existing car bays, and I was wondering how that's going to work for access and ingress.
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, that's a good question. The applicant originally proposed visitor car parking bays behind all 4 of the bays, so a visitor bay for each property, basically. The proposal now is for visitor bays to be dedicated to those 2 tenancies that have the visitor bays behind them. So there's nothing in the R codes that restricts that, so technically it meets the deemed to comply standards in the R codes. Those 2 bays were taken off the ends to allow more room for landscaping and the truncations as well. There is scope for the bays to be put back in, so if council has a concern around that, it could be accommodated with the truncations provided, and it wouldn't impact the landscaping significantly. There just need to be some bollards put on those truncations to ensure that those bays are appropriate and they're not going to affect the landscaping.
Just to delve on that a bit, so these would be general visitor bays for anybody accessing the property, or would those be are those visitor bays specifically tied to the parking spaces that are in front of them?
Through you, Mayor Cole, practically they would have to be tied to those 2 tenancies, those 2 units that have the visitor bays behind them, because those 2 residents wouldn't be able to access their parking bays if there were visitors in those bays. So practically, that would be the only way of addressing that issue. And again, as I mentioned, the R codes don't set any restriction around the visitor bays being open to all the units. It just simply says that there needs to be 2 visitor bays provided for a development such as this.
On the building bulk and scale that a number of the local residents have raised, we've had some discretion proposed for setbacks, and the report talks to articulation. Is that articulation specifically because of the top, I guess it's the headroom for the lift? Is that the articulation that you're referring to in the report?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the articulation relates largely to the stairwell, breaking up that wall. The stairwell is set back, and the stairs are set back. So the wall isn't one flat wall. There is articulation in that wall that provides additional setback. It's different on each side, but the wall is broken up. There are other reasons that the administration determined it met the design principle, including the different materials that are used in the facade, the red brick, the feature brick, the different shades of render, and there is a significant amount of glazing as well associated with that stairwell. The lot is sits within a 3-storey area. The third storey component is very central to the building and will largely be invisible from the street and the adjoining properties. And the proposal doesn't include major openings that overlook the adjoining properties, so we considered it met the design principles of the codes in that regard.
Technical question, the report proposes screening as a condition to the car parking, and I just can't get my head around how that how do you screen the car parking without, don't they have to drive through the space where the screens would go?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, there's probably a couple of options. One would be doors that would come down and up for each of the car bays. The other option would be to have gates that go in front of another car bay so that one car could come in, and then when that door closed, the other car could come in. So there's a couple of options in that regard. It wouldn't be a straightforward issue. The applicant would need to come up with a design to address that screening, and the city would assess it to ensure that it provides an appropriate presentation to the right-of-way.
So you'd end up with some form of physical barrier, a movable physical barrier then, effectively?
Yes, that's correct.
Are you able to share some examples just to give... I can't visualise how this is going to work in my head. Is there something that you could share to help conceptualise that? Somehow?
Yes, through Nicole. It's simply a gate that goes in front of the car bays and screens them. It wouldn't have to be a completely solid door or anything like that, and that probably wouldn't be an appropriate treatment. It would need to be broken up because otherwise it would present probably worse than the current situation. So.
Nearly done. Member of the community raised from the gallery about Design WA and how once Design WA comes into place, this will change the requirements around setbacks. I just hope you could give some feedback on how or where the city considered Design WA in this development.
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole. Design WA was released last week, just before the agenda was released. We have since done an assessment against Design WA, and in relation to the lot boundary setback specifically, Design WA sets a 3 metre setback to the lot boundaries. As you can see in the report, the R code sets a lesser deemed to comply standard of between 1.5 and 1.8 metres. The design principles are essentially the same in Design WA as they are in the R codes, and so the assessment hasn't changed in that regard. So after undertaking the design principle assessment, the city has come to the administration has come to the same conclusion that it meets the design principles in that regard.
Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you. A few quicker questions, hopefully. The proposed undercroft, there was, hopefully for their sake, not for our sake, or Councillor Loden's sake, the proposed undercroft has way less than 50% of the built form under natural ground level. Does that still qualify as an undercroft? Or should it be considered a story for the purpose of calculations? I know the absolute height is there, but should it be considered a story given that the parking is not proposed to be underground when viewed from the laneway?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, I'm not aware of any definition or provisions that relate to undercrofts. If it's the definition of story...
Happy for it to be taken on notice, that's fine. So
the definition of story came under the old scheme, so that definition has now fallen away. So it just comes down to whether it has a ceiling above. So in this case, it would have a ceiling above. I'll need to check if there's any other requirements around the definition of story that would apply in this instance, and provide that in the briefing notes.
Thank you. There was a question asked of us during the week in relation to the site levels and the survey that was provided. Have you had a chance to review that and confirm that the site levels as presented in the plans are accurate?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, we have not undertaken a survey ourselves to confirm that the survey provided by Cottage Engineering, as you can see in the in attachment 2, the first plan in attachment 2, is correct. Cottage Engineering are qualified surveyors, and their survey shows the levels that are on the site as far as the city is concerned.
Thank you. The applicant presented some information in relation to the NDIS. Can I just ask whether that has formed any part of the application consideration, or whether that has any relevance at all in planning terms? I understand that they're obviously touting the benefits or potential benefits of the development, but is that got any relevance to the consideration of the proposal?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it's not a relevant consideration for the decision maker for council. It is something that the city has worked with the applicant to ensure that we can try and deliver that outcome in the context of the proposal. So it's something that we've discussed with the applicant, but it's not a relevant consideration under the planning regs.
Okay, and just in relation to the parking, you mentioned that if council was of a mind, that's for council to determine, but if the applicant was of a mind to utilise 4 bays and to still provide protection for that, for the landscaping, and particularly the 1 metre truncation, are they able to do that without seeking further approval? Are they able to provide 2 additional bays? If it was approved as recommended, would they be able to provide 2 additional car bays? And would they be able to show them as private property, not common property, if they weren't provided as visitor bays?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I think, without having undertaken a review of the appropriate provisions in the regs, which relate to whether an amendment to the DA would be required under those circumstances, but on the face of it, it seems that that would be possible. They could add those bays without the need for further approval. Yes, because it does meet the engineering, the Australian standard requirements, so there wouldn't be any engineering issues, and unless there was a specific provision, a specific condition prohibiting the use of that space for parking, I believe that it could be done without further approval, yes.
And does the landscaping plan as presented rely at all on the vertical garden walls that are shown in an undercroft, north and south facing, adjacent to walls?
Through Mayor Cole, no.
Okay, and just further to Councillor Loden's question about the car parking and the visitor bays, in the event that this ends up with 4 vehicles parked there, what provision does the city, other than the words visitor potentially being written under what's shown as Bay 1 and Bay 2, what is open to the city to prevent the dwellings being, I know they'll be shown as common property, but them being effectively permanently used as tandem bays by the occupants of those dwellings, so effectively all 4 units either being sold or leased with 2 dedicated bays?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, the strata...
Sorry, Director, I think the CEO just wanted to jump in there, if that's okay.
Through you, Mayor Cole, just to clarify Councillor Topperberg's question about the universal access provisions for livable homes, the changes to the R codes which are coming in the next 3 months, which the Director mentioned, does have a new section related to universal access and the livable homes requirements, and that does reflect the increasing demand for livable homes as part of the NDIS.
Sorry for that, Director. Please proceed.
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole.
For the benefit of those, it might be helpful if we go to some page 57, the area that we're talking about, which is the access to the bays.
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, the visitor bays wouldn't be able to be allocated to specific lots for the purposes of resident parking. They would be required for visitor parking. If residents were parking in there permanently, if that would become a compliance issue, because those bays are required as visitor bays. They couldn't be used for permanent parking for residents.
Okay, but I understand earlier that you said that they would, practically speaking, need to, because the ARCOS doesn't preclude it, would need to be allocated to units 2 and 3, which means they're already allocated, which means there's no potential visitors for units 1 and 4. And potentially units 1 and 4 would have 2 tandem bays, because as you said, they could quite easily provide those as tandem bays, even though it's not as shown on the approved plans or on the proposed plans. So effectively the compliance action could only be enforced if the city was able to prove that the occupants of what's marked as visitor bays 1 and 2 were persons who were temporarily visiting units 2 and 3, because nobody else is able to park there anyway, because they have to be tied to those units. So if I wanted to go and if I was a plumber for unit 1 and wanted to go and park there, I couldn't do it because it would have to be tied to those units. Is that correct?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes. you couldn't park in Visitor Bay 1 and 2, practically. The resident for Unit 2 and 3 wouldn't be able to gain access to their property.
And just a final question, the questions about overshadowing and leaving the 3 metre setbacks as proposed under Design WA, but if the setbacks were made to be compliant where there's been concern expressed, what would be, do we know what the impact would be on either the overshadowing or solar access for the property? I think primarily we've had concern from the property owner to the north, but I guess for both the north and southern properties, is it possible to get a diagram of what it looks like with compliant setbacks just in terms of overshadowing prior to next week, please?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, we can provide that.
Councillor Gontaszewski.
So I just want to clarify that because the R codes are silent in relation to a visitor bay, don't specifically define a visitor bay as being available to visitors of any of the units of the development. It has been assumed as part of this assessment that a visitor bay can be permanently tied to a specific unit, and just whether that's been tested anywhere, and in the sense that it doesn't. So it's essentially the silence of the R codes rather than any proactive definition of a visitor's bay or any testing that's been done in that regard.
Yes, through Mayor Cole, that has been the practice of the city in relation to other applications where we've had a strata application that's tied a visitor bay to particular units, for instance, or a particular commercial tenancy and not to the residential units. So our practice has been, if we haven't had the ability under the R codes definitions to defend requiring the visitor bay to be common property for all units, we have allowed that strata to be approved with the visitor bay tied to particular properties. The other thing I'll just point out is that the R codes require 1 visitor bay for the development as a whole. They've provided 2, so that's another thing just to factor in that's not included in the report.
Councillors. Councillor Castle.
Through you, Mayor Cole, just one quick question. We've had a question raised during the week relating to the width of the laneway. Have you been able to confirm what the drivable surface width is, and particularly if that's different from the fence-to-fence width?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, the city's engineer has gone out on site yesterday or today, I think it was, to measure the width, and they've measured it as 5 metres, the width of the bitumen to be 5 metres, and they've considered that the laneway is it's not in excellent condition, but it is in good condition and adequate condition for vehicles to travel the laneway in either direction.
Councillors, any further questions? Just further to that, Director, is that to both travel in either direction and to cross at the same time? Travel?
Yes, to pass.
To pass,
correct.
Yes. Okay. Look, I just wanted to reiterate, I'm really keen to see the overshadowing diagram if the Design WA setbacks were applied to the side setbacks, particularly interested in the southeast. I did want to ask a question about the justification for the reduction in the setbacks. I understand that on the northwest side you're talking about the articulation by the sort of recessed stairwell. On the southwest east side it appears to be quite a large blank wall. Can you just talk me through the rationale for the variations on the setbacks on that side, please?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, the wall is still broken up with the stairwell, the boundary wall with the stairwell above, and the windows in that facade also break up that wall. So though the stairwell on the opposite side is a lot larger and the breakup of that wall is greater, there is still articulation of the other wall. So you can see the kitchen projects forward, the living area projects further back, the stairwell also breaks up the wall. It's in a different way to how it breaks up the wall on the other side.
I also just wanted to, further to Councillor Toppelberg's question about the undercroft, my understanding was also that an undercroft car park was defined by whether it was sunk by at least 50% under natural ground level, so I just wanted to understand that a little better.
Yes, through Mayor Cole, there was a definition under the previous scheme. I understand there's also a definition included in Design WA, so we can look at that and provide you with some information on that definition.
Thank you. And also just in relation to the store on the roof, it's from the perspective of looking at the built form, it is unusual to have a box that is a store on the roof from my perspective. Is that, if that wasn't a storeroom, would that still be required to house some of the lift mechanics, or is it just wholly a storeroom? And is there any comment from administration on how that affects the bulk and look of the development?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, I understand that it will also be used to house some of the lift equipment, but I'll need to take that on notice and provide you with some information around that. The visibility of that space, because it is of that additional height, because it is located centrally, it largely won't be visible from the street or the adjoining properties given the setbacks, and the two-storey development will largely screen that additional height.
And there has been a lot of concern expressed by the immediate neighbour in relation to overshadowing if he were to subdivide his property. Can you please address that issue?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, the assessment of overshadowing is taken based on the current lot configuration, so we can't take into account a potential future subdivision of that lot, and because the overshadowing is less than the 50%, it's deemed to comply with the standards of the R codes and considered to be appropriate.
And just a question also came from the public gallery about the 1.5 metre landscaping strips in the parking area. If you could please address that.
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, the truncations, so the proposal doesn't include the 1.5 metre landscaping strip either side of the driveway into the bays, into the resident and visitor bays. In order to address that concern, administration's required the truncation areas at the point that it adjoins the right-of-ways to be landscaped. Given that that will be the only area that's visible from the right-of-way in the public realm, it's considered that that will address the intent of those 1.5 metre landscaping strips and provide sufficient landscaping to soften the impact of the driveway on the right-of-way.
Okay, councillors, any further questions on item 5.2? No? Okay, thank you, Director. We'll move on to the other item that was most raised this evening from the public gallery. That's number 58 Kalgoorlie Street, Mount Hawthorn, single house. Councillors, questions on this item? And just to note that Councillor Toppelberg has left due to a financial declaration of interest. Thank you. Councillor Gontaszewski.
I just note that a number, through the iterations of the design, there's been an increased use of glazing to the front, on the front outlook, the front setback. Is it confirmed that this glazing will be clear glazing, or is it intended, could it be frosted in any way?
Through you, Mayor Cole, currently on the plans, there's nothing to say whether it will be frosted or clear glazing. If Council was of a mind to approve the proposal, then it's something that could be conditioned either way.
Councillor Rodan.
Just a question that was raised during engagement with residents prior to the meeting. There was a comment provided that this does not meet the rear setback requirements, which is 6.5. versus I believe it is a 1.1 setback. Could you provide some feedback on that, please?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, the setback requirements included in the report, the 6.5 metres, are the setback requirements included under built form policy in order to protect the amenity of rear properties when sites were redeveloped at a higher density. Those setback requirements haven't been adopted by the Commission and require their approval. The proposal complies with the deemed to comply setbacks included in the R codes, which are 1 metre for the gym wall and, was it 3.9 metres for the stairwell. They've provided 4.1 metres for the stairwell and 1.1 metres for the gym.
Councillors, can I just follow up on that question? Sorry to interrupt, just because it's relevant to that one. Often with these provisions, we'd still deem them to be seriously entertained and take them into consideration. Is that not the case? Why is that not the case? And would that be something that would be defensible if this matter was appealed, if we did try to enforce the built form policy 6.5 metre rear setback?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole. It has been taken into consideration as part of the assessment. It's included in the deemed to comply assessment table. We need to rejig that so that we discuss it in the comments section only and make sure the deemed to comply table reflects that it currently meets the deemed to comply standard of the R code. So we'll fix that up before the council meeting next week. It is something that council can have regard to, but given it meets the deemed to comply standard of the codes, it is currently deemed to be appropriate under the codes, and so it would be very difficult to, on that basis alone, refuse the application. I think that the broader objectives of the residential zone would need to be a factor in that assessment if council considered that was inappropriate. And we can provide an assessment against the objectives and the deemed to comply standards of the built form policy in the comment section. I think that will probably help that discussion.
Sorry, Councillor Gontaszewski.
It was just a question in relation to the reasons for the refusal in terms of the screening of the upper floor terrace. This is in relation to the screening to the neighbouring properties, because from the presentation and the elevations, it appears that the upper floor terrace isn't screened to the street and does provide passive surveillance. Is that correct?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, that's correct. The applicant has clarified that the screening at the front will be visually permeable and won't be above 1.1 metres in height. So there was some uncertainty around that, and that was why that ended up in the reason for refusal. But again, we'll adjust that to reflect what the applicant has since clarified.
Councillor Castle.
Through you, Mayor Cole, raising a question that came from the gallery today about the roof terrace and the impact on amenity and overlooking and perhaps noise in relation to the neighbours. Can you just clarify the position on that, given that the wall around that is 1.6?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, the wall to the roof terrace at 1.6 in height meets the deemed to comply standards of the R codes when it comes to visual privacy, so that 1.6 metre high screen will ensure that there's no overlooking of the adjoining properties. They will be able to look up and even out, but they will not be able to look down as a result of that 1.6 metre high screen.
Can I just ask a follow-up question, if you'll allow me, Councillor for Tarkas, because it's relevant to that? Just when you look at the setback variations, the report talks about terrace setback on the south from 3.8 down to 1.6. In the meeting that we had with residents, the acting manager did talk about 4.2. I think there were two different figures, one in the report and one in the table. So just seeking to clarify whether it is 4.2 or 3.8. But the question, the bigger question is, was the impact on amenity, other than visual, taken into consideration in the reduced setback, both from the terrace and also from the upper Rumperson stairs, which is a variation of from 3.3 to 2.1. I'm talking about other amenity issues such as noise. Was that factored into the consideration?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, the acting manager has clarified that and checked, and the assessment number in the report is the correct number. So the assessment was updated following that to correct that. So the report is correct.
So 3.8. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
And in relation to the assessment, the impact on the adjoining properties in terms of visual privacy and bulk was considered, but the impact in terms of noise isn't a factor that's listed as a relevant issue in the design principle. So it wasn't something that was taken into consideration in relation to the design principle assessment.
Thank you, Councillor Tarkas.
Thank you, Mayor. That answers my question.
Sorry about that. Councillors, questions? Look, I just also had a question in relation to, what was it? Oh, in terms of the stairwell, because there has been, because I think a lot of the comments go to the bulk, the rear setbacks, overlooking, and I know that stairwells are not treated as habitable rooms and therefore don't have overlooking provisions, but I just wanted to know whether there could be any discussion with the applicant about whether that staircase or access to the terrace could somehow be taken from inside rather than have the external staircase, which does add to the bulk at the rear and bring that setback closer to the rear neighbour.
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole. I'll take that on notice and speak to the officer who's been working with the applicant on this. And if they haven't had that discussion, and even if they had, we'll contact the applicant and provide that in the briefing notes.
Oh, the other question that did come up was around the height measurement at the rear of the building, given that that's slightly stepped down. Can we just have a clarification as to whether the measurement of the rear height is from natural ground level?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, we've confirmed that the height is 7 metres from natural ground level.
And just finally, I did note that the resolution of the plans on the Info Council are quite blurry, so I'm wondering whether we could just check the resolution so that councillors can view the plans more clearly.
Yes, through Mayor Cole, we'll check that and see what we can do.
Thank you. And also just one final thing in relation to the removal of the Verge tree. Can we just have a bit of information about the age and condition of the Verge tree and species?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, we'll provide that in the briefing pack.
Thanks. Any further questions before we move on? No? Okay, thanks, councillors. Okay, I'm going to next go to item 8.4 because we had a couple of public members of the public gallery speak to this item as well. This is the Floreat Athena Football Club request for in-principle approval of a new 5-year lease. Questions in relation to this item? I'll just wait for Councillor Toppelberg. Does Councillor Toppelberg know he can rejoin us? And just, look, this is a late item, so I'm not sure whether council members have had a good opportunity to go through it and read it in detail, so we'll understand if you haven't had that opportunity, and you're also welcome to raise questions during the week. Councillor Rodan. Sorry, just for the benefit of Councillor Toppelberg, we're just looking at 8.4, the Floreat Athena Football Club request.
Thank you, Mayor. My question is just around the request is for an in-principle approval for a new 5-year lease. My read of the recommendation is that's not provided, but from what I can hear from the gallery, the Float Athena is happy with what is provided. Is that correct?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, the correspondence from the club does explicitly request a new 5-year lease. As we've identified through the report, the provision of a 5-year lease, when Council considered that back in November 2017, was on the basis that the club completed a range of requirements. Given the fact that whilst we know the new board is working on those, but they haven't been completed yet, administration didn't find it appropriate to support that 5-year lease. However, the CEO and myself have been having discussions with the relevant department from the federal government and have discussed with them the wording of recommendation number 5 to ensure that that does give the Australian government appropriate assurance that the city and the club will be working towards longer term tenure at Litter Stadium in whatever form that may take. So the Australian government were comfortable with that wording, and today I did discuss the wording of that recommendation with the board chair as well.
Thank you. Given the advice provided by the department in relation to more questioning about the urgency, the letter was received on the 21st of February, and I've still got some questions as well. Given that the department essentially has said that there isn't a requirement for a 5-year lease to be in place immediately, can I ask if there's any issue if there's any urgency for this to have to come to the next council meeting, if we've got other issues that we wish to discuss?
Through you, Mayor Cole, what we have confirmed with the federal government is that the club is required to provide quite a substantial amount of project information to the department by the 31st of March. As part of the information they're required to provide, certainty of tenure, or more so assurance that the federal government's investment will be maximised through a long-term tenure arrangement is an expectation from the department. So whilst it has been difficult getting a report prepared in such a short time frame, it is clear from our conversations that the department does need some level of understanding about future tenure for the club at Litter Stadium. So we've just tried to reach a balance between providing that assurance to the federal government to ensure that the grant assessment can continue, whilst still respecting Council's 2017 resolution that notes there's still some work to be done before we do confirm those tenure arrangements. So I guess in summary to your question, Councillor Toppelberg, from an administration perspective, we do see the importance of providing some form of resolution around certainty of tenure for the club by the 31st of March.
Just a further question in relation to the November 17 decision from Council, and specifically the facilities management plan. At that time, there was an expression of, I suppose, hope that there may be significant funding available for the development of the facility, and $3 million of that appears to have been is potentially forthcoming. Have we seen anything in any detail from the club in relation to the proposed facilities management plan, and specifically looking at my understanding of the request is effectively we're being asked that if we don't provide the security of tenure, they can't get the money. But the key aspect which we've been asking for the last 15 months is to prove that even if money is spent, whether it's $3 million or $300 million, that the club has the ability to be able to then manage the facility so that that money is appropriate, or that investment is appropriately managed on behalf of the owners of the facility, which is our residents and ratepayers. Have we had any detail at all provided by the club in relation to the facilities management plan?
Through you, Mayor Cole, no, the city hasn't been provided with any of the information or studies that Council did require to be completed by 2017. In fairness, the new board and the new board chair has acknowledged that none of that work has been completed in a timely manner. However, they are now addressing them. Notably, in terms of the facility management plan, not only is that a requirement of Council in response to that November 2017 resolution, but it's also a requirement as part of the information that the department requires now to assess the grant. So the club needs to provide that one, to ensure that they do have the capacity to manage Litter Stadium, to ensure or give council confidence that a long-term lease should be considered, and also to be provided to the Australian government in order to secure the $3 million.
In relation to shared usage of the facilities, and I did ask some questions of you in relation to potential increased use in Britannia Reserve as well, but have we, and I understand what's been expressed, or the information we got in the correspondence from the current chair of the board of the club, have we had any conversations with any of the parties that have been spoken to by Florida Athena to assess their interest or the desire? Because it seems to have been presented to us that without this 5-year guarantee of tenure that nothing is going to happen in terms of co-location or use of the facilities. Have we had any direct conversation with any of the entities that have engaged with Florida Athena?
Through you, Mayor Cole, administration has engaged directly with 2 state sporting associations. One of those came to us and we forwarded them on to the club. Another one actually came through one of the local primary schools, and then we facilitated a conversation between that state association, the local schools and the club. So we're certainly aware of 2 state sporting associations that have had conversations with the club regarding co-location.
Okay. I'll ask it quite specifically because my concern or my issue is we're being told that unless there's a security of tenure, these other organisations aren't interested in, potentially not interested in co-location at the in the space. Have we confirmed if that is the case, or if the potential co-location is reliant upon us extending the lease as opposed to the development of the facility or their access rights or otherwise, because the information we're being provided has only come from Florida Athena to say that it's contingent upon the length of tenure. Are we sure that those are the issues of concern or contention, or are there other issues, or is there no issue of contention and they're happy as long as the stadium is available?
Through you, Mayor Cole, my understanding of the club's position is that they're not necessarily linking the requirement for this tenure certainty with co-location actually occurring. Whilst co-location is referred to in the letter that's been received by the city, realistically the co-location conversations are occurring anyway. I know with one particular sporting association those discussions are very advanced and likely to result in some increased use of the stadium and Britannia Reserve this calendar year, regardless of what happens with the federal government monies and tenure. So whilst it is certainly referred to, the co-location discussions within the correspondence from the club, my understanding is that there is no direct link between co-location in the short to medium term occurring and this resolution of councils this evening.
Councillors, Councillor Castle.
Through you, Mayor Cole. I'm just trying to understand this document, having only just read it. I'm just wondering, does this new resolution, particularly clause 4, does that change the timeframes around our requirements for the club to provide those documents? Does it or does it in fact set a deadline for the provision of those facility management plan, etc.?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the intention of recommendation 4 is quite simply to reiterate what Council already resolved in 2017, which was administration providing an update to Council no later than June 2019, advising on the progress of items 4.1 to 4.5 as the basis for Council then to decide whether to exercise the 1-year option from January 2020 to December 2020. So realistically the intention of recommendation number 4 is just to reaffirm that previous Council resolution.
So would it be correct to say that there currently isn't any specific deadline to provide those documents, other than that it may not be viewed positively when we come to consider the lease?
Certainly, Council made it clear in November 2017 that if there wasn't sufficient and satisfactory progress made on items 4.1 to 4.5 by June this year, that that lease option being entered into and any further lease options after that were very unlikely for the club.
And just one follow-up, have we had any indication through this immediate process that they're any further along in that process, and that June 19 deadline or sort of deadline could be met?
Certainly the board chair has advised administration that the new board is now getting on with progressing these studies. Importantly, as I mentioned previously, at least some, if not all of those requirements actually requirements of the Australian government as well, that they now require to properly assess the grant. So the club now needs to progress all of these requirements for two reasons, as well as to satisfy themselves that they've got the capacity and the financial capacity in particular to withstand, I guess, a long-term lease at Litter Stadium.
Councillor Tarkas.
Yeah, through you, Mayor, it's just following on from Councillor Castle's question. In this instance, for what you're saying is that a number of those items under Condition 4 are likely to be required by that 31st of March deadline for the federal government. Are we in a position to be able to request those documents earlier than that June, our June deadline?
Through you, Mayor Cole, we can certainly request a copy of all of the documentation that the club submits to the Australian government by the 31st of March, some of which will satisfy those requirements. I'm just mindful that the previous resolution, however, does provide the club up until June 19 before we are required to report progress back to council, but we can certainly request all documentation that's submitted to the federal government by the end of March.
Councillors? Director, just because there's been some commentary around those dates that were provided previously, and so that there's no misunderstanding that this in some way replaces the previous resolutions, could those dates be added back into the proposed motion?
Yes, certainly.
And also just to reinforce in clause 5 that it's not just financial governance and facility planning, but that community benefit is critical. Perhaps we need to just add that into clause 5. I'm happy to do it by amendment if administration doesn't believe it necessary.
Through you, Mayor Cole, that was just an attempt to summarise the items above, so we can just insert that for clarity.
And just in relation to community benefit, maximising that at Litter Stadium, could there be further conversations with the club around conversations happening with bringing new sporting groups, community groups, etc., to Florida Athena, to Litter Stadium, that those conversations happen with the City of Vincent, so that we ensure that maximum community benefit from the city's perspective is in sync with perceptions of community benefit from the club's perspective, so that we don't have a scenario where we are having further users coming in that are not perhaps reflecting community need.
Yes, we can certainly make sure that continues, Mayor Cole, and that has been the approach that's been taken to the last two state sporting associations.
And just to support Councillor Tarkas's request, I think it would be useful for the city to be included in documentation that goes to the federal government, so that we're across those documents, if that would be appropriate from the club and the Australian government's perspective.
Yes, we can certainly make that request of the club.
Councillors, any further questions on this item? Again, I know it was a late one, so there may be questions that come once you've had time to further consider it. Okay, thank you. I'm just still working through items that were raised by members of the public gallery, and I note that there are still people waiting. One of the items that was raised a number of times was 7.1. That were the minutes and motions from the annual general meeting of electors held on the 29th of January 2019. Councillors, are there any questions in relation to this item? Councillor Rodan.
Just on motion 1 that Murray raised, can administration advise what the timeline would be for the development of the character retention policy?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, the corporate business plan sets out that the project will be completed this financial year. It's quite the background work is quite well progressed. I'd just point out that once the policy is updated, it won't necessarily implement character retention area over particular spaces. It will simply set up a revised and streamlined framework for the community to work with the city to implement character retention areas and heritage areas. So once that policy is adopted, any community groups or areas that the community would like the city to investigate will then need to be, provisions will then need to be put together with the community, consultation will need to occur with the community and council before a change will be made. So even though this project's proposed to be finished this financial year, implementing a character retention area on new areas will take time after that. And I can't provide a time frame because it will depend on the results of the community consultation, really.
Councillor Rodan.
So just carrying on from that, so in the context of the Cleaver precinct, the appropriate step from there would be for, I think it's 40% of the community of a designated area to agree to a proposal to be submitted to council for consideration to be adopted as a character retention area.
Yes, through Mayor Cole, under the current policy that's the case. It will depend on the amendments that are made to the policy as a result of this project. So it will depend on what that says and the process that's set out there. But the aim is to have a streamlined process. So I would anticipate that it wouldn't take the same amount of time that some of the other proposals have taken, provided the community support is there.
Councillor Hallett.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor, to the Director of Development Services. Just a follow-up, I guess, on those questions. Has there been any work so far around investigating Cleaver Precinct for character retention? Conversely, with the, I guess, heritage, which has been raised previously. The second part is there any reliance on waiting for the policy to be revised before that can be progressed? Or would your recommendation be to wait until the policy has been revised in order to have a quicker process?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, I can't comment on the results of the assessment for Cleaver Street. I'm not aware of those. I can provide them in the briefing pack. We have considered a proposal for Cleaver Street in the past, and so I wouldn't recommend progressing or recommending to progress an application for Cleaver Street again under the same policy when it's already been considered under that policy until the amendments been finalised. So at that point would be the most appropriate time to review the Cleaver Street precinct again. As is mentioned in the report, a number of streets in that precinct are already heritage or character retention. And so, yeah, a broader review of that precinct it'd be best to wait till the amendment of the policy is finalised.
Councillors. Councillor Castle.
Through you, Mayor Cole, it was raised in the gallery in relation to motion 2, in regard to Robertson Park, that it needs to take priority perhaps over other master plans, or that in the very least some of the work that needs to happen there should happen sooner rather than later. Can you give us any idea whether those sorts of works are possible and what sort of time frame we'd be looking at for a master plan?
Through you, Mayor Cole, we're obviously going through the corporate business plan review and the budget process for next year. So in response to the outcomes from the recent consultation and the outcomes from that meeting, we are now looking at do we have the resource and the funding capacity to prepare that development plan or master plan next year. That will obviously need to be considered amongst all of the other master plan projects already included in the corporate business plan, but we certainly have taken away the community's sentiment that they would like to see this happen sooner rather than later.
Councillors, any further questions? Councillor Toppelberg.
Just a question through you to the CEO. There was a question from the gallery in relation to council workshops and spoke about the response apparently being that there was an issue with administration not wishing to speak about matters publicly or otherwise. Have I missed something in the report? My understanding was that we'd be presented with a procedure and that would come to council and therefore give the community to make comment on it, and there was no position taken on whether, at this stage, whether the meeting should be made public or otherwise. Is that correct?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I had a conversation with Dudley Meyer on Monday in relation to what were formerly known as public forums. It wasn't in relation to council workshops, but there was some crossover between what were formerly described as public forums, where members of the public were invited to attend, and what are now the closed forums called council workshops.
But if I'm correct, what we're going to be voting on next week is a recommended procedure coming back to council for consideration, and that will provide opportunity for elected members and the community to make comment on that proposed procedure and whether it should be open, closed, or open to the public, published or otherwise.
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, exactly.
Councillors, any further questions on this item? Okay, I'm just trying to work out what was... I think we're back now to items that were just raised once from the public gallery. So I think the first item that was raised was in relation to parklets, so that was 5.10, amendment to the parklet policy, number 2.2.13. Any questions in relation to this item? Councillor Rodan.
I just wanted to clarify, as the policy stands, the parklets would basically have the same liquor licence hours and times as per the development approval that is for the relevant adjoining development, and that's my understanding. So is that correct, firstly?
Through Mayor Cole, administration will have the discretion to apply whatever hours of operation it considers appropriate. Probably would, in most cases, probably would be the hours that are set out in the planning approval.
And then if we were dissatisfied with how that was being operated, we would have the ability to remove that ability or to restrict those hours of operation?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, given the parklets sit in the road reserve which the city is responsible for managing, we could terminate that arrangement at any time.
Councillor for Tarkas.
Okay. Through you, Mayor, to the Director. So what would be that process of termination? What would be required?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it would just be as simple as advising the user of the parklet that the city requires a road reserve back, and we would give a reasonable period of time for that to occur, or that we propose a change, and we'd again give a reasonable time for that change to occur. But there'd be nothing stopping us from ceasing that immediately if we thought it was appropriate.
And also through you, Mayor, to the Director, in the event that the business is sold, is the approval transferable, or do new owners of the business need to reapply?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it would apply in the same way as the liquor licensing applies, which I understand the new owner needs to apply for again. So,
Thank you. Just in relation to those questions, I think that's probably is there a way that the city is able to register the entitlement to the use of the parklet as a whole, regardless of the liquor licensing, but to register the entitlement on the lease such that it is known that it's at the city's discretion? In principle, avoiding somebody renting a broom cupboard with a parklet out the front and then on selling the business or the lease to somebody because of the existence of the parklet, and misrepresenting that the parklet is tied in some way to entitlement rather than actually being at the sole discretion of the city. I understand due diligence comes into it, but when someone turns up here saying the city's going to ruin their business because they've been on-sold this lease potentially, is there a way that we can force it to be similar to a Section 70A on a transfer of land? Is there a way that we can force it to be registered on a lease that the parklet exists purely at the discretion of the city?
through you, Mayor Cole, there's none that I'm aware of. The parklets, this change only applies to parklets that have been funded by a business, so it doesn't apply to any other parklets. I'm not aware of, other than through the parklet policy, which is on our website, future lessees being aware of the restrictions and requirements.
I guess what I'm asking is, whilst we're amending the policy because it's a potential issue, that and particularly when you start to deal with access to further licensed square meterage at a net rate of $0 rent, that has potential for causing issues for people who will either purchase businesses or take over a leasehold. Assuming that is in place, are we able to require via the policy that it be registered as part of their lease, or that it be noted on the lease that the access to the parklet is solely at the city's discretion?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, that's something that seems possible. We will have a look into it and provide some information in the briefing notes.
Councillor Castle.
Through you, Mayor Cole, I'm just trying to get my head around how this operates in relation to alfresco areas. So is it going to... I understand it won't have impact on neighbouring properties with alfrescos, but might we have situations where a business has both alfresco and parklet? Does the liquor licence apply seamlessly throughout that area? And, is there any kind of negative impacts that we need to consider in how that might operate?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, Just Burgers would be an example. They have a liquor licence over their alfresco area. The liquor licensing there's a whole heap of rules and requirements around liquor licensing in the public space, and ensuring that there is the path of access for pedestrians is protected. We have the same requirements in our policy, which requires the 1.5 metre clearance zone for pedestrians. I don't think there's going to be any issues with allowing liquor licensing over a parklet. We already have a number of alfresco spaces where there's liquor licensing on both sides of that pedestrian footpath. So there's alfresco against the wall of the building, and there's also alfresco on the curb line, and there's not been any issues associated with that. So it would be treated in the same way.
And further question, you said this is only going to apply to parklets that are business sponsored, so not to the city's funded parklets. Do we have any that are shared between businesses or have the potential to be shared, and does that cause any issues if you might have two businesses who utilise the same parklet area but might have overlapping liquor licences? Is that a...
Through Mayor Cole, all of the sponsored parklets have been paid by single businesses, so we wouldn't have any issues with or instances where two businesses would want to use the space for the same thing, and there would be a conflict. So as far as I'm aware, that shouldn't be an issue if it's just applying to the sponsored parklets.
Can I just ask, because it's relevant, I guess when you look at the Leederville Hotel alfresco area, the licence is held by Leederville Hotel, but the agreement with the city is that a patron can bring food from any business in Leederville, or even their sandwiches from home if they wish. Is that, so if you had a situation where you had a parklet, not that this is really only being considered for hosted, but if you did have a situation like that, you could still have a host with a licence, but then others would still, the way parklets operate is that they still retain that ability for patrons to bring food from any provider. And that would be the case continuing at Just Burgers and Pincho's.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Councillor Hallett.
I guess a follow-up to that, does that mean that people could also bring their own alcohol to those parklets?
Through you, Mayor Cole, no.
And also, given that it would be under delegation to admin, is there a way that we can potentially have just a list of parklets that have this approval in the information bulletin or something similar, knowing that it's a very small number?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, we can provide that through the information bulletin or another mechanism.
Councillors, any further questions? Okay, I'm just going to ask members of the public gallery, is there anyone that is still waiting here in the public gallery on Banks Reserve Master Plan or the Tennis West proposal for Robertson Park? Okay, I'll just continue through the planning items then, because I know that a few of you are waiting on those. So we'll go to item 5.1, which is 14 Orange Avenue, Perth, second storey addition and alterations to a single dwelling. Councillors? Councillor Gontaszewski, you're just scratching your nose. Okay. Any councillors have questions? Councillor for Tarkas.
Through you, Mayor, it's just regarding the frangipani tree, and in the report there was a certain degree of reliance on that tree for screening. And it just got me thinking, we've had this discussion previously with regards to trees on private property. So really, where does that place council in the ability to ensure that the tree's not removed, seeing there's been such a great reliance placed on that tree for screening?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, the frangipani tree was considered as part of the landscaping assessment, the deemed to comply standard in the city's built form policy, which hasn't been adopted by the Commission but is something that we've considered and something that needs to be given due regard. It requires 30% canopy coverage over that front setback area. The frangipani tree currently provides 27.64% canopy coverage and could provide the 30% once it reaches maturity. The applicant has also proposed an additional tree. The tree that they've proposed isn't, the species selected isn't considered appropriate, so the species that ultimately is provided there together with that frangipani tree will provide appropriate canopy over the front setback area. The trigger to require the frangipani tree to be retained will be the landscaping plan that's required to demonstrate that, and that will also demonstrate the species of the new tree, require the retention of the frangipani tree as well. So that's how it will be retained and protected. And if it disappears for some reason, it will need to be replaced.
Councillors. Director, I just wanted to ask about the alteration to the roof line. Given that this is a duplex and that no longer mirrors the adjoining home that shares the common wall, has the neighbour expressed a view on that, the fact that the roof line will no longer mirror one another? And I note that the chair of the DRP provided advice on the setback variations, but did they provide any advice on the roofline solution to provide further screening of the second storey?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, I'll take that on notice and provide the adjoining owner's comments and the DRP's comments in the briefing notes.
Thank you. Any further questions on this item? Okay, we'll move on. The next item that was raised in the public gallery is 5.3 Oxford Street, 251 Oxford Street, Leederville, change of use from therapeutic massage to consulting rooms. Any questions on this one? Councillor Hallett.
Just in relation to the bike parking that's been proposed in the proposal, did that come straight from the applicant, or was that a suggestion from administration around kind of addressing the shortfall in the car base?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I believe that when they were preparing the parking management plan, that was something that they identified to address the shortfall in car parking.
And it's fine for the briefing notes, but if have any of the adjacent premises had to apply cash in lieu for parking?
Through you, Mayor Cole, we'll take that on notice.
Councillor Rodan.
The report refers to the availability of parking in the area. I was just wondering if administration had any data on what parking is available in that proximity.
Through you, Mayor Cole, we might have to take that one on notice.
Councillors, Councillor Toppelberg.
There's a comment on page, where are we? Page 90, that the applicant said that there'd be a 15 to 30 minute break between appointments. That is not captured in any of the, and I know that it can potentially be viewed as unduly onerous, but that's not captured in any of the recommended conditions. I guess in terms of the potential impact on car parking and the use of the facility, the limitation of 2, even though there's 3 consulting rooms, the limitation to 2 provides some relief, but that having a gap between appointments would probably have the greatest impact on the requirement for parking, because you obviously double the requirement if people are being seen back to back. Is there a way that that can be captured? I know we've done it previously with approvals, for example, for yoga studios or otherwise, where they're operating within areas where parking is tight. We've demanded a break between class times. Is it possible to, or would it be wise to recommend that even a 5-minute gap, at least having a gap between appointments, so that we don't have the next appointment waiting while the first appointment is still in place, especially considering the length of time that was suggested by the applicant is 15 to 30 minutes between appointments?
Through you, Mayor Cole, we can add a condition of approval that requires appointments, visits by appointment only, and can include some wording in there as to requiring a break between each booking to allow for that crossover.
Can I just ask if you can please liaise with the applicant to see whether they would be amenable to that and prepare it? I'm not sure that I'll necessarily move it, but at least have it prepared for next week, please.
Councillors. Councillor Gonchevsky.
Just in relation to the waiving of cash in lieu, like if, or in terms of if a future application was to come back that requested to remove any of the conditions around the use of the premises in relation to the number of consultants, or for example in what Councillor Toppelberg's talking about in terms of the timing, would that then trigger a review of the cash in lieu component of the, would that then trigger a review of the parking?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the way that the parking policy is currently structured is if a application came in to vary this approval, we would reassess the parking. However, if council resolved to waive the car parking requirement and waive the cash in lieu, then that waiver would be applied to the future parking assessment.
Is it possible in some format to include a reference to show that councils or the decision makers' assessment of the parking impact of the development is based around both the implementation of the parking management plan and also of the restrictions of the use of the premises? And if it is possible, would that go some way to potentially triggering a review of the a cash in lieu waiving, or I guess I would appreciate some advice. My concern is in relation to if we put these things in conditions and the conditions are required to be amended because the subsequent use of the property changes, that then does impact on the parking, and so it does impact on the decision around the level of impact as under the car parking policy. So I guess I would be grateful for any advice on the way forward here or in the briefing notes.
Through you, Mayor Cole, we can certainly add something to the report to reflect that the decision to waive the parking or the consideration of that relates to this specific land use, and then future assessments could be informed by that commentary, and we can review the conditions around that, but we can certainly add something in the briefing notes to address that concern.
Councillors. I just have a couple of questions. I just want to ask whether this change of use represents any intensification in use from the previous therapeutic massage operation. Was this the former pregnancy spa? No? Okay. Not that one?
On the face of it, it would seem that it's
okay,
less
I can
intensive.
see why you're all laughing now, but come on now, I'm talking planning speak here.
It would seem less intensive in terms of the previous approval didn't provide any limitation on the number of staff on the site or hours of operation. So this is now a more confined approval, whereas the previous one just related to the land use and didn't have any limitations on the operation of that land use.
Okay, but in terms of consulting rooms, and so there was no restrictions on number of staff or visitors at one time, or consulting rooms under the previous or current use?
No, the current approval dates back to 95 and was issued, or 2000 was issued by the Planning Minister, and simply relates to the approval of the land use and provides the plan in there.
Right.
We can provide some further detail.
But in terms of the actual, there's no building works or extension of the building proposed?
No. There's only internal, no internal alterations proposed. It's using the existing building footprint.
Okay, and so there hasn't then previously been given an approved shortfall as part of the previous planning approval?
Don't believe so. The records that we had available indicated that Council had recommended refusal for the use, and that the landowner and applicant had appealed that to the Minister, and the Minister had overturned that under the previous Planning and Development Act.
Okay, I just also want to ask a question about the statement of proposed use of the site, which is from the applicant, and that's on page 96. It talks about the fact that given that there are 3 psychologists, that the parking will be provided for the psychologists, but then one of the conditions is that there will be no more than 2 practitioners on site at one time. So are we able to provide a condition to say that one of the bays will be for a visitor to the premises?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, we should be able to draft a condition to reflect that. I believe that the statement of purpose was prepared when the applicant lodged the application and wasn't aware of our requirements, and then they reviewed their practice when they prepared the parking management plan.
Okay, thank you. I think it would be useful. Thank you. Any further questions on this item? Okay, thank you. Next item is 5.6, number 46 to 52 Britannia Road, Mount Hawthorn, amendment to existing approval, street fence for 4 multiple dwellings, unauthorised existing development. Councillors? I did have a question, but I was sort of banking on you guys to ask the first one so I could go to the item. Just some hold music. I just wanted to ask, there's a number of photos provided with the report that shows non-compliant fencing, and I just wanted to ask, was that something that the city officers put together, or was that provided by the applicant? It starts at page 174.
I'll just check, Mayor Cole. I understand it's provided by the applicant, but...
Okay, so...
Yes, it's part of the applicant's justification.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to clarify that wasn't a random sample, but provided by the applicant to demonstrate other non-compliant forms of fencing around the area. That was my only question. Any other questions on this item? Well, actually, going to that issue, Director, I think it would be useful for councillors to have information about the actual area that this fencing is in. I do note that there are other new developments along Britannia Road that do have compliant fencing, and I think it would be useful to have a bit more of an understanding of the streetscape along there, and whether, whilst there may be non-compliant fencing in other areas or further up Britannia Road, in the immediate locality, I think it would be good to have a bit more of an assessment. I personally will go and have a look myself, but just in case other council members would find that information useful.
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, we can provide some photos in the briefing notes. There is some commentary in the report that the adjoining properties have Britannia Road as their secondary street, and so they have blank walls or fences, and they're solid fences that aren't visually permeable at all. But we'll provide some photos that actually demonstrate that streetscape, because it is quite clear that this is the one property that requires visually permeable fencing, while the others adjoining it nearby, immediately adjacent to in particular, are all solid.
But as I point out, there is actually some new development that does face Britannia that does have compliant fencing as well, so I think that should be demonstrated as well.
We'll provide that as well, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions? No? Okay. So they were the items that were raised in planning from the public gallery, so we'll continue to go through the planning items now. Items that we haven't dealt with, item 5.4, shop 1, number 228 to 232, car place Leadable, change of use from eating house to tavern. Questions? I did want to ask a question about the hours, given that the condition is to go from 11:30 to 10 p.m. on Sundays and public holidays, and it's again that issue of Sunday before a public holiday, and whether there could be any discussion with the applicant on that restriction to 10 p.m. in that situation.
Yes, through Mayor Cole, we'd be happy to revise that given the previous decisions of Council on those issues. We've simply used the current policy without considering previous recent decisions of Council on that, so we'll speak to the applicant, and they certainly are looking for that because they applied till midnight on Sundays and public holidays.
Yeah, so it's a reduction in their hours anyway.
Yeah, we'll revise that and explain that in the briefing notes.
And just in terms of understanding car parking calculation, the conditioning to 178 patrons would mean no intensification and no additional car parking demand, but what should the eating house component be providing for car parking, and will this issue of access be resolved?
Through Mayor Cole, I can't say whether the issue of access will be resolved or not. The current approval certainly requires this premises to have access to those car bays. We will need to, and we already have contacted the owner requesting that they provide public access to those bays, or access for any users of the premises whatsoever. I can't comment on what the outcome of that compliance investigation and discussion will be, but it will be to provide access for this premises to those bays in some form, unless a report comes to Council to amend the previous approval Council issued, to amend that in some form. But that'll be the stage that it'll be discussed. Otherwise, they'll need to provide access to some of those, at least some of those bays for this use.
So there's 23 on-site bays. So what are they? What is there a number that they're required to have access to as part of this approval?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, it's 14 was the calculation.
And also, just to clarify, do they currently have access to the long-term bike bays?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, my understanding is they do, yes.
Thank you. Councillors? Councillor Gonchevsky?
So I just want to clarify in terms of the change from a restaurant cafe to a tavern, that is, the difference is essentially that in a restaurant or cafe they have to provide seating for the number of patrons, whereas in the tavern they don't have to provide seating for the patrons. Is that correct?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I don't think there's any requirement for seating. Practically, they would require seating in a restaurant, typically, but there are options around that. Obviously, they can more readily reduce the amount of seating provided for a tavern, absolutely.
Okay, so I'm just going on the definitions in the LPS. Is that where it's drawn from? But I guess I'm just trying to wonder the purpose of the application, because my understanding is that the approval is approving a change of use but no additional patron numbers. Is that correct?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, the purpose from the applicant's perspective is to allow them to be able to serve, to get a tavern liquor licence and serve alcohol without a meal. When it comes to the maximum occupancy that they currently have. They don't have a limit under the planning approval. They just have a limit in terms of the Building Act, which limits them to 172. So that's how we've landed on that number. There are probably a number of practicalities around how many people they can have on the site at the moment, given the way they run their business. But technically there'd be nothing stopping them from having 172 persons in the restaurant currently, if they change the configuration and how they ran their business.
Councillors? Okay. Next item, 5. Sure. Sorry, you didn't speak, so I wasn't sure, but I recognise you now. Yes, how are you? Yes, we can go to 5.8. A request from the floor. 24 Ellesmere Street, North Perth, 4 multiple dwellings. Councillors, questions on this one? Waited all this time, we're not going to ask a single question. Yeah, I don't have any questions. Anyone? No? No questions. Okay, back to item 5.6. No, hang on, we've done that one. Oh yeah. Item 5.5. Number 1 of 150 to 154 Oxford Street, Leederville, amendment to existing approval for eating house. Questions on this one? No? Okay, I think I have a question. Just trying to read my writing here. Just in relation to any intensification, it talked about the fact that there's no the increased number of persons does not detrimentally impact the locality, but then it seems to suggest that there's no intensification of use. So I know that we've gone from a floor area to a patron calculation, but is there actually any difference in the number of people that would be attending the 58 people versus what the floor area calculation would have resulted in? I'm happy for you to take it on notice.
From a parking point of view, technically, yes. Based on the floor area that previously was approved, they would have been able to have a maximum of 52 people in total, and now they want to increase that to 58 persons, which has resulted in the increased parking. So if you base it on what that previous floor area was and the parking that was approved, there has been a slight intensification.
Thank you. Councillors, any further questions? Okay, next item is 9.9, amendment to the Municipal Heritage Inventory, number 3, Mignonette Street, North Perth. No questions? Okay. Amendment to 5.10, amendment to policy, oh no, sorry, we've done that one. 5.11, amendment to policy number 2.2.8, laneways and rights of way. Councillor Hallett.
Just in the track changes in the policy, it refers to needing to comply with the consultation provisions of Landgate, and I'm just assuming that that doesn't preclude it also having to comply with any future changes in City of Vincent consultation policies and the like.
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, there's a catch-all provision in there that says any other, in Landgate's policy, that says any other consultation the local government considers necessary, so no, that it doesn't preclude further consultation.
Councillors, just preempting a question around consultation, I was just wondering what the rationale is for not advertising the change to the policy. Is it because it's based on Landgate's guidelines?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, the administration sees that this is simply a change to the policy to align with Landgate's requirements. So it's an administrative change to ensure that everything that we're doing aligns with Landgate's requirements, which is currently the case. We have to follow Landgate's requirements in any case now. So.
And just I think this was raised previously, but the process for the city undertaking area-wide naming, does that need to be spelt out, or is that something that would just, because this is really dealing with single or, names that are coming and being put forward by individuals rather than the city doing a sort of further name the lanes type project?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, the process and the procedure that's been set out in Attachment 4 has been deliberately put together to allow it to fit with different scenarios. So it has been designed so it could fit with a broader project to name laneways that currently aren't named, and that would essentially go in a circular. It'll be a circular process. So we go through that process by asking for nominations for names, advertise those, and then we'd advertise the project and request names, and then we would again advertise all of those names. So it's been deliberately set up so that we can go around in that loop until we have a set of names that the community, there's consensus from the community around which name it should be. So it's been deliberately set up for that. So hopefully there won't be any issues, in my view, to do a different type of project.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Thank you very much, Development Services. We move on now to engineering. Item 6.1, business case for the adoption of a 3-bin food organic garden organic system. Questions? Councillor Rodan.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to understand the financial analysis. I got a little bit confused around in the numbers, but from what I've understood, there's a 1.4 million capex cost to purchase all the bins that are required, and then an additional $43,000 in OPEX going forward as we project forward. So there's a net cost ongoing to the city, but depending on what happens we don't know. Am I correct in thinking that if we get a $5 a tonne increase in the levy, this will mean that rather than a 43k OPEX cost, we'll see a 27k capex saving? And then similarly, there's potentially a 390k saving to the $1 million capex, 1.4 million capex cost as well. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Do you, Michael? Sorry. Sorry. Apologies.
So, and then there's also the potential for decreased processing costs of 190k a year as well.
Do you, Michael? Yes. In the figures, we've included $135 a tonne, but it's more likely that will come down to around $100 per tonne for processing. But the markets are yet to be established, so that's where we're at the moment.
So the current base case would suggest a net negative impact on the city's budget projecting forward, but if these scenarios come through, you could see potentially a 4 to 5 year payback on the initial capital outlay, assuming the better bin savings and the reduced processing costs and increased landfill levy.
Do you, Michael? Yes, that's correct.
Councillors, I have a few questions, so please feel free to take them on notice. I think the main one for me is that I would like to have consideration more around, some investigation into implementation and issues around bin storage. I know that there's categorisation of multiple dwellings and single homes, but I think even within that single home category we're going to have to talk around bin storage for a range of different housing stock, and I think people have already started asking me this question, so I'm just wondering if we could please include in the report information around implementation, and potentially I was thinking that I could move an amendment to add a new clause 2.3, which would talk about request administration to provide an implementation plan to council to consider issues arising from community consultation and other issues such as bin storage.
Yes, we would use all the information from the consultation to inform going forward as well. So yes, that's not a problem, adding that amendment.
Yeah, I just would question whether we need to have another category or to look. Or we talk about in the business case talks about having MUDs and single residences, but I think it's a bit more nuanced than that in the City of Vincent, where you've got narrow lot homes, etc., multiple group dwellings, etc.
As part of the project management plan, we would look and do a site-by-site assessment. We're already doing that as part of the MUDs project, but we would build that into the project management plan too.
Also, I think it would be useful to include in the report under financial and budget implications what the current gate fee is for Tamala Park. And I think it would also be very useful to have information under financials that would go to the issue of Mindarie Regional Council and the sort of issues that we're dealing with on that regional level around the RRF and the fact that that's currently being looked at by Mindarie Regional Council and whether that could be FOGO compliant, whether the city's going to be obligated to then use that plant, and knowing the background, that's probably likely to be more than $100 a tonne to get FOGO through that plant. So I think that there is, for me, that's the key piece of financial information that is missing from this analysis is the strategic and the strategic issues that MRC are dealing with around that operation of that plant, and also the costs to the city as a member council in no longer using the RRF in its current capability, and what costs may then flow from that. So I think that for me that's a part of the equation.
Yes, we can certainly add that. It is mentioned within the report, but certainly not to that detail, so we can add the level of detail that you require.
And also, I know this will be an issue that comes through the budget process, but it talks about setting aside $80,000 for the 1920 financial year, and just that question around whether we need to start allocating additional funds to the waste reserve to afford the infrastructure, given that it's going to be quite costly exercise for the city. Also, just on page 459, the report talks about the West Australian State Strategy aims for a consistent 3-bin curbside. I think that probably is really more requires or is mandating rather than aims for.
Yes, we can do that.
And just finally, we talk about the fact that the 3-bin system funding has come to an end, but the state government refers to financial mechanisms from the state government. I'm just thinking it might be useful to include a new sub-clause to state that the city writes, or the mayor writes to the Minister for Environment to seek further information on what financial mechanisms will be available from the state government to support implementation of the 3-bin system, so that we can use that to inform our financial modelling. There are probably others, but I can chat to you during the week. Any other questions? Okay. Next item is 7.2, 2019-20 budget process timelines and separate waste charge. Any questions? Councillor Rodan.
I probably have a simplistic understanding of the rating process that we go through, but the report refers to it taking 6 months to make the shift in the system to go from what we currently do to then adding in a waste charge. Why is it that it takes such a long time when it's just effectively a line item, and then we multiply rates by a rate in $1.
Through you, Nicole, the issue is the rating system that we're using is probably, I don't think the right way to say this, doesn't give us the capacity to make significant changes, which this would be because it is actually separating out a charge that isn't a rateable charge without an awful lot of work, and we would be relying on external providers for that. Their capability and availability would mean it is a 6-month process.
So just to delve a little bit deeper, I guess, so we're able to obviously tweak. We've got our 50 million budget that we have to raise each year, of which 30 odd million is recovered from rates. If $10 million fell from the sky and we needed only 20 million to raise in rates, we would struggle to make that work within our current system.
Through you, Nicole, if it was rates as we currently apply them, it wouldn't be. That does work with our current system because we use the percentage rate to develop our rates notices, but this would involve pulling out a separate amount that doesn't have a rateable percentage, and that does require some systems changes. In the perfect world, we would have a system that we could bring a consultant in and update that within a matter of weeks, but we're not in a perfect world with our systems. It would require a lot of work to make sure that the system was accurately producing rates notices, and that would include a significant amount of testing. We're basing that on experience with other local governments that have implemented separate waste charges using the same system as us. While I'm saying 6 months is probably the longest amount of time it would take, I wouldn't want to underestimate the amount of time that it would take.
And then finally, I believe there's an ICT project to update this system, and if so, when is that scheduled to be completed? The
ICT strategy development has kicked off. This would be, the rate system would be one small part of an overall strategy. I would expect that looking at the amount of work that needs to be done, we would probably be looking at making a decision in about 12 months on what would be the ideal rates packages. There are new packages coming to market, but they're not well tested at the moment. In 12 months' time, we would hope that we would start to consider some of those newer packages rather than the two basically that are available to local governments at the moment, meaning that we're subject to a duopoly and we are really held to ransom by the providers to some extent.
So in that case, if we were of a mind to consider this next year, we would still be in the same boat in terms of the rating tool?
Through you, Nicole, I think we would certainly be in a better position than we are now. We would either have managed to make some upgrades to our current system, or we would be very close to considering implementation of a new system. It would make sense to do that as part of next year's rates process.
And then a question through the Chair for the Director of Engineering. In terms of time frame for the FOGO, we're doing a trial in 18-19, and then when would likely roll out and full understanding of the financial implications for the city be known?
Through you, Michael. So the implementation is scheduled for October 2020, the full implementation of FOGO. That's when the costs would really kick in. I think we'd have a full idea of the costs somewhere around 6 months before that. We would go out to tender, because it's some of those tenders that are really going to tell us what the processing costs and the collection costs are going to be. So I would anticipate about 6 months before October 2020 we'd have a good handle on that.
So if this was a barrier to implementing a waste charge, you would be looking at the 2021 or 21-22 budget?
Through you, Michael, that's correct. We wouldn't be looking for the 19-20 budget. It would be the year after. So it would probably be, if you wanted full sight of the costs, it would be the year after we introduce FOGO.
So if it's introduced in October 2020, we'd be looking at July 2021 to June 2022.
That's correct. From understanding of your question, it would be the 21-22 budget would be the time.
Councillor Doppelberg.
Thank you. Just in relation to an email, it's only slightly related, but I did send an email a few weeks ago in relation to the bulk waste collection. Can I just confirm that the current tender expires this year? My understanding is we approved it in 2016 for a period of 3 years, and this would be the third year. So just A, confirming that that tender does come to an end this year, and B, that we haven't gone out to tender again yet.
Through you, Mayor Cole, yeah, it expires in June this year.
We can ask further questions by email, Councillor Doppelberg. Councillors, any further questions on item 7.2? Councillor Murphy.
Just wanted to know if the administration, through you, Mayor, is aware of any measures implemented by other councils who have implemented separate waste charges to subsidise pensioners disadvantaged by it at all?
Through you, Mayor Cole.
A rebate? Yeah.
Sorry. Through you, Mayor Cole, I'm not aware of any. We have asked a few councils. We can certainly ask a few more and put that in the briefing notes.
Great, thanks.
Councillor Castle.
Through you, Mayor Cole, yeah, follow up to that question. Are you aware of the experiences of other local governments who've introduced a separate waste charge, and whether that's actually displayed a benefit, or they've seen a reduction in their waste in the time since that might be more of a question for engineering, and whether they've actually been able to demonstrate the benefit of it?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I think that probably is an engineering question, so I'll handle that one.
Yeah, through you, Mayor Cole. From my knowledge and experience, I'm only aware of councils that have had established waste charge for quite a long time. I'm not aware of any recently that have introduced a waste charge, so I've got no personal knowledge of the benefits or the disbenefits of that. I mean, a better answer might be we could take it on notice and see if we can find anything out before we put the briefing notes together.
Councillors. Okay, moving on to item 7.3, investment report as at 31st of January 2019. Item 7.4, authorisation of expenditure for the period 1st of January to the 31st of January 2019. Item 7.5, financial statements as at 31st of January 2019. Item 7.6 is a late report that hasn't come to us yet. That is the Local Government Statutory Compliance Audit Return 2018, which was considered by the Audit Committee today. Just to note that no concerns or issues were raised by the Audit Committee. Director of Corporate Services, could you just advise when item 7.6 will be available?
Thank you, Mayor Cole. That will, I think, be available tomorrow. We should be able to put that on Docs on Tap tomorrow now that it's been reviewed by Audit Committee.
Thank you. Item 7.7, late report. This was late. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to review it. This is the mid-year budget review 2018-19. Councillor Hallett and then Councillor Rodan.
Through you to the Director of Corporate Services. Just in relation to the general purpose funding, just wondering if I can get a bit of an overview of what that includes and I guess the rationale for why the budget's changing or the reason for the change that's expressed there. And then a second one just around joint ventures, that there's a lot of zeros from now into the future and compared to the past. I'm just wondering, are we no longer involved in any joint ventures?
Through you, Mayor Cole, if I can come back to the first question in a minute, but the joint ventures, as far as I was aware, the issue was only the reduction in proceeds from land sales, but I can look into that further. I'm not aware of anything at the moment. And just on your first question, that was in relation to...
The general purpose funding, what does that include or what's that normally used for?
I'll have to take that on notice, thank you.
A couple of queries. First one, we earned an additional $210,000 from 7 JDAPs. I was just wondering, through refer to design and review panel, I was just wondering how that works. We charge people for that?
Through you, Mayor Cole, if you, in relation to the JDAP applications, the fees... sorry.
So it just refers to $210,000 additional that we earned from 7 JDAPs for design and review panels.
Okay, through you, Mayor Cole, I'll have to clarify that comment between now and next week. The $210,000 was received for the JDAP applications that have been lodged with the city. Those funds are then sent to the department. So there's an in and there's an out, and you'll see that there's 2 comments around that. The design review panel fees are roughly in line with the budget that was anticipated, so I'll make sure that that comment clarifies that the JDAP fees come in and they go back out again.
So a 40% drop in TPRC revenue, which is quite significant.
I can answer that one if you don't mind, Director, 'cause seeing as I was at the TPRC meeting on Thursday night. There has been a significant budget financial mid-year review at TPRC, but the distributions to members is unchanged, so I'm not quite sure why our figures were out there. Just to give you a bit of an outline of what is happening at TPRC while we're on this issue, lot sales income was budgeted at 16.36 million, but that's been revised down to 9.43 million. But equally, land development costs have decreased by 7.54 million. So the final result is actually an increase in the surplus of 1.55 million. So the distribution to members is unchanged, but basically what we're seeing at TPRC is stagnation and as little as 1 lot sale a month. But because they're not then proceeding and developing lots, then we're just stagnating and the time frame is stretching out. But when I checked the figures, the distribution was as budgeted when the budget was set by TPRC, and I just wasn't sure whether there was a sequencing issue around when our budget was set and when TPRC provided the forecast or the distribution figures to the city.
Thank you, Mayor Cole. My understanding is that the figure that we used for the budget was higher than what we've recently been advised, but I'll confirm that in the briefing notes. We certainly advised that profit on sale of assets is anticipated to come down, and hence the adjustment to the budget. But I will confirm that in the briefing notes. Okay,
so at the TPRC meeting on Thursday, we were told that the 4 million distribution to members is unchanged, and as we're 1/12 of that, that's 333,000 recurring. So I'm not quite sure what happened there.
Thanks, Michael. I'll have to look at the timing of it because we do have 333 now, but our advice prior to setting the budget was higher than that.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Rodan.
Just one final question, just to confirm my understanding. So we've seen decreases in income and increases in expenditure overall across the income and expenditure items, but then that gap has been plugged by transfer from reserves, specifically the Asset Sustainability Fund, and then savings in the capital budget. Is that a correct interpretation?
Through you, Michael, yes, that's correct.
Just to follow up on that, I do just really want to flesh out that the Asset Sustainability Reserve is being used for the solar panels, so that is new and different and needs to be brought to everyone's attention. What will be the balance of the Asset Sustainability Reserve once the solar panels is funded from there?
Thanks, Michael. I will have to get back to you with the exact amount.
Councillor Rodan.
Given the solar panels will deliver a cost saving to the city over coming years, is there some way that those funds will be funneled back into asset sustainability?
through you, Mayor Cole, we haven't been transferring regular amounts into asset sustainability. They've been quite specific. We can certainly look at that as part of this year's budget. I'll add that into our information for the next budget workshop.
Councillors, any further questions? I note that there hasn't been a lot of time to digest the mid-year review, so please feel free to ask questions during the week. Okay. Thank you, Director of Corporate Services. We're moving on to community engagement. 8.1 late report Banks Reserve Master Plan extended public comment feedback. Councillor Rodan.
Just a couple of comments raised from the gallery. Could the Director provide a response around the contention that we've increased the amount of parking around Banks Reserve? And secondly, did we consider a jetty for the purposes of sailboats? And I think the third one was around collision of cyclists and walkers, and what are the visibility and sightlines for those two junctures of intersection of cyclists and walkers?
Through you, Mayor Cole, in terms of the car parking, I think it is a fair point from the community member that there does need to be the right balance between retention and increasing our POS and the provision of parking to support that POS. The master plan fundamentally provides 3 areas of parking. The first one is really just the consolidation of the Summer Street car park. There's currently informally about 20 bays in that car park. What will be provided when that car park is upgraded is 17 bays. The other car park that currently services the pavilion currently has 12 bays. What is proposed upon the proposed demolition of the pavilion and the construction of the Banks Plaza is to provide a car park of approximately 20 bays to service that area. So that is an increase of about 8 bays. The most significant car parking area proposed through the master plan is actually linked with the new community facility that obviously remains subject to further needs analysis and a business case, but that does propose an additional 46 bays. That's a new parking area as well as angled bays along Joel Terrace. And that is, I guess, one of the challenges associated with building a community facility that would have a sizable area that could accommodate large activities, and therefore needing a car park to service the community facility as opposed to the other 2 car parks that basically service the reserve. So they are the 3 car parking areas. For the most part, there's a slight reduction in Summer Street, a slight increase at the current car park near the pavilion. Most of the concern through the public comment process has been around that car parking associated with the community facility, the new community facility, I should say. In terms of the second point raised, a lot of the feedback through the public comment process was about improving connections and accessibility to the river, and so that has been a strong focus by maintaining and improving access to the existing beach and the spit, and also increasing access through the revegetated areas through the boardwalk. Council is obviously aware that we have 2 jetties not far from Banks Reserve that we're currently grappling with in terms of understanding current utilisation and the significant capital costs to upgrade and then maintain those jetties. Given the fact that there are already 2 jetties in close proximity, the master plan really tries just to improve accessibility from a fishing sense, from a kayaking sense, and from a just being able to put your feet in the water sense, rather than the mooring of boats necessarily. Administration are fully aware of the redevelopments that are happening in and around Banks Reserve. There has been consultation with the MRA regarding the power station. We did have discussions with adjoining local governments, but we were mindful that a lot of the feedback that came through the consultation process was maintaining the neighbourhood feel of this reserve and not increasing utilisation too much. And that was a strong reason why we steered away from including any formal boat and jetty infrastructure as part of this master plan. The third comment, again, is a very relevant one, and one that came very much through the community consultation and that was the conflict between cyclists and pedestrians. There are a number of ways that we could address that. Some feedback came through UMAG, some feedback came through the landscape architect, and a lot of feedback came through the various consultation methods throughout the project. And administration, in consultation with the project reference group and the architect, made the decision to not necessarily separate the users in their entirety. And one of the main reasons for that is, yes, there is conflict along the existing path, but one of the main areas of conflict is actually the fact that whilst these directions aren't quite spot on, the pathway runs north-south, and that's where most of the cyclist traffic is. A lot of the recreational traffic is east-west from the river to the playground and park areas, and indeed the master plan is looking to increase that activity along the river, and therefore the east-west movement by pedestrians and park users will inevitably create conflict with the cyclists, no matter what we do with the treatments on the existing path, or if we do try to separate the pedestrians and the cyclists in their entirety. So one of the main focuses along the path has been to make it wider, to use traffic treatments along the path to try and slow down the cyclists, but importantly reduce the points where that conflict occurs, and that's where the approach has really been around the planting of low vegetation, so that at least those points where pedestrians and cyclists come together, that will happen in a fairly controlled environment and less frequently than currently occurs. Importantly, this is a master plan, and administration was mindful that we've got a great deal of consultation through this process, and we feel that it's come to a point now that it meets the city's and the community's needs. There are many comments that the city has received that now is just not the time necessarily to delve into that finer detail. The detailed design phases of the project that now occur is very much the time for that to happen. So I appreciate the comments from the Mayor in the sense that administration has gone through all of these submissions, and there's no less than 16 pages of overview of the consultation feedback that we have received. Much of that remains relevant. It's just not now the opportune time to necessarily deal with all of that. The detailed design phases certainly are. And given the importance of this reserve, the level of capital investment required, each of those detailed design phases will be subject to further consultation and council decision making.
Councillor Castle.
Through you, Mayor Cole, just to further the discussion about the bike path, I'm just wondering if it might be worth putting some of that detail that you've just mentioned into the body of the report, in particular to explain why one of the other options that was considered, which was to move the bike path, the cycle part of the bike path above the existing or across the brook, across the top of the plaza, and why that ultimately wasn't the preferred option. And also I think really to tease out some of the things you were talking there about increasing that, or really channeling those crossing points to decrease the conflict, and the fact that we have improved line of sight once the pavilion has gone. That will, so I think some of that could be explained a little bit better in the report. I also had a question about the rumble strips and whether we've had any discussions with the neighbouring local governments about extending those strips and signage beyond the scope of the park and beyond our borders, so that the cyclists who are commuting to and from the city and travelling at quite fast speeds, which is part of the problem, that they have quite significant warning that they're approaching this, multi-use zone, so that they're not screeching to a halt as they hit the borders of Banks Reserve. And perhaps that can be taken on notice, or as a suggestion as part of that detailed design part of the project. The other question I have is in relation to the active zone and that calculation of open space. We had some discussions earlier in the year about the net loss or gain of open space, and I'm just wondering if I can get a bit of clarification of what the total outcome is, and in particular that difference between unrestricted open space and whether eco-zoning should be included as part of the public open space that is available in the park, and whether we're actually seeing a reduction here or overall we might be seeing an increase. It just would be good if that was a little bit clearer in the report.
Through you, Mayor Cole, certainly just in regards to that point, administration's view is that whilst we're changing to eco-zoning potentially within Banks Reserve, that doesn't represent any loss of public open space. Public open space is still there, it's still freely accessible. It does potentially change the way that open space can be used, and we can look at maybe getting some better clarification in that regard in the report. But importantly, the introduction of eco-zoning is a positive thing, and I would not like to equate that with any perceived net losses of public open space.
Councillors, Director, I have some questions. I'm happy for you to take them on notice. It talks about in the report that the cost to make the existing building the required works to a functional standard would be excessive and costly without having to cause a huge body of work. I'm just wondering if that's something that a figure could be estimated based on the assessment of, we call that asset, like or not elements, functional, some asset speak that escapes my mind right now. Levels of service.
Through you, Mayor Cole, I'm sure our Director of Engineering would be able to assist us in that regard, and we'll get at least an order of magnitude in the briefing note.
I think that would just really help, given that people in their community consultation talk about sprucing it up, and that I think we really do need to give a figure to that. Also wanted to know what the total number of submissions were that were received, whether they've been categorised as support, object, or a mixture. That sort of we've had a lot of the analysis, but we haven't had that sort of that sort of level of detail. Also, just wanted to know whether we could have more information in the report on the naming or co-naming of the reserve, including the origins of the name Banks Reserve.
Through you, Mayor Cole, certainly that's one thing I did note. The December report that came to Council did include a level of analysis in terms of how many submissions received. That appears to have dropped off with this extended consultation period, so we'll certainly include that. In terms of the naming, co-naming, we can certainly include additional information. There is a significant amount of work that has been done, and I think it's important to reflect what's in the master plan within the council report as well.
And just in relation to the recommendation, clause 3 talks about with the naming. It doesn't mention co-naming. It says naming of Banks Reserve. Talks about consulting with Wodjuk Working Party and other relevant stakeholders. To us, that's probably clear, but I think for a community member, it might be nice just to include in their the local community, given that issue was raised by members of the community. That's it from me. Anyone else? No? Okay. Thank you, Director. Next question, next item is 8.3, Late Report Tennis West Proposal for Robertson Park Results of Consultation Process. Any questions? I just did want to raise the question that was asked in the public gallery today about the referral of, in clause 3, to a Robertson Park development plan. Was that intentional? Is that of a different order to a master plan?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes. When we prepared the public open space strategy, although we didn't specifically define terminologies, we looked at all of the reserves that required upgrades over the coming years and really assessed them based on their complexity, and that was a combination of how many different users use a particular public open space, what existing infrastructure is on an open space, where that particular park finds itself on the POS hierarchy and what the future demands of that POS may be. And for those that were deemed to be more complex, we identified them requiring a master plan. For those that were quite complex but not as complex as a master plan, we identified those as requiring a development plan. And for those more simplistic open spaces, we identified those as requiring a landscape plan. So that terminology is actually what you'll see within the actions within the public open space strategy. Really, administration was just seeking to maintain consistency with that public open space strategy, notwithstanding the fact that the community had put forward the need for a master plan, and I understand a commitment towards a plan, a master plan or otherwise, was discussed at the community information sessions. So it's slightly semantics from an administration perspective. At the end of the day, what we need to do is look at current utilisation and current infrastructure at Robertson Park and plan out what those future needs are and what will satisfy the needs of the local community. But that really is the rationale behind using that particular terminology.
Well, if it is administration's view that it should be a development plan and not a master plan, could there be some wording around that in the report to explain the differences and what the categorisation means and what lesser work, if that's a perception, may or may not occur? And also, are we fixed to this wording? Because I think that when you talk about park and development in the same sentence, that often creates concern in the community.
Through you, Mayor Cole, certainly not fixated on any wording. It was really just trying to identify the different scales and intensity of public open spaces we've got and the appropriate level of planning that is associated with that.
Okay, and just one other thing. I just wondered whether the report, it does sort of go to this, but could it be made more clear in the report that this was a Department of Local Government, Sport and Cultural Industries consultation with support provided by the City of Vincent? It talks about the city supporting the two forums, but for me, my understanding has always been that this was the department's consultation and that we supported and hosted their consultation.
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's correct. So we will just reaffirm that in the wording in the report.
Thanks. Councillors? Okay. Item 9.1, Organisational Structure and Designation of Senior Employees, Policy number 4.1.7. Okay, no questions. Late report, Corporate Business Plan Progress Update. Councillor Rodan.
Just a question on item 1.1 in there, which is the Sustainable Environment Strategy. It's shown as, I guess, an at-risk item on the CBP. This has been a long outstanding item for the city, and previous discussions with the Environmental Advisory Group have been that this is manageable. We will be able to have this delivered in the time frame, and they will be able to deliver budget items out of that strategy. So I was just wondering if that's no longer the case.
Through you, Mayor Cole, in response to the question, part of the intent of that formatting is to give an indication on whether a project from when the first time it was initiated is on track or on time. And your question implied it has been a long-standing commitment, so it's long overdue. So it's already over time, therefore possibly over budget and at risk of not being delivered on time. So it's meant to encapsulate the last cycle of a project from when it was first approved by Council, not whether or not we're going to deliver it now, which will still be later than what was first intended.
So the expectation would still be that it's delivered in this financial year? Okay.
Councillors, Councillor Hallett.
I had a similar question about the ICT strategy and just whether or not there's anything we can do to progress that, given that it underpins many of the other things that we do.
Through you, Mayor Cole, we have got a dedicated resource on that at the moment, but unfortunately, just because of some other priorities in ICT, it's probably not getting as much attention as we'd like. We're doing everything we can at the moment, but I would expect that once we recruit the new ICT manager, we'll have a much clearer plan and timeframes around it.
And I guess just if there's any budget process that can assist that.
Through you, Nicole, we are spending some time this week going through anticipated budget impacts, and they will come back to the next budget workshop. There will be, I imagine, fairly significant budget implications if we want to do anything quickly, but you have to weigh that up against the risk of not doing something quickly.
Councillors? I just wanted to ask about a couple of the deferrals. I'm interested in the project delay for the artwork to be delivered in 1920. And I think that was the one I wasn't aware of. It just... Character retention and precinct planning, we were just discussing that one and it sounded like that would be happening this financial year, so just clarifying that one as well. That's, so the printing's so small I can't read it. It's in the yellow.
Through you, Mayor Cole, we'll take the artwork delay on notice, only I haven't been briefed and received an update on that one since returning from leave. Councillor Murphy may be able to assist, otherwise I'm certainly happy to get some administration advice and include it in the briefing notes.
Yeah, look, my understanding was that the guys that work was happening on it in terms of engagement and progressing the project, but it wouldn't actually be delivered until next financial year. Early next financial year.
I guess that's the thing, that it would be good to know whether it was going to be July or June. Like it would be good if it's going to be delayed to have an idea of whether work is progressing, briefs are being put out there, and it's just a matter of actually the delivery might take the artist some time to deliver, as opposed to it's not going to happen till June next year.
Through you, Mayor Cole, just a general comment on this summary report. There's a supporting documentation now under a soon-to-be adopted project management framework where administration will provide monthly updates to all the reports required and requested by Council, and I can circulate the supporting document for this summary report in the morning.
Fantastic, thank you very much, CEO. That's great. And the other one was just on the character retention area of policy that we were just discussing previously.
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, I'll need to take that on notice to understand what's changed to the time frame and the exact end date that's now proposed.
Thank you very much. Any further questions on the mid-year review? Okay. Last item for the evening is 9.3, Information Bulletin. Are there any questions? No. There being no questions on that item, there's no motions and no general business on this agenda, so I'll declare the meeting closed at 9:23 p.m. Thank you, everyone.